A quick word before we get into this week's episode.
I was talking to a head of school recently who said, Peter, we've got a strong strategic plan, but every time we try to act on it, things stall. If that sounds familiar, you're not alone. Big goals are easy to write down, but they often get bogged down in the daily, making it hard to stay strategic. That's why I built the school operating system. It's a framework that helps you align your team and focus your priorities so you can actually execute the plan. We work alongside you to extrapolate a one-year plan from your existing strategic plan, break it into 90-day sprints, and design a much more effective meeting rhythm that moves your team closer to your strategic vision every single day. And that's just the start. We support much more to help you build the operational infrastructure your plan needs to succeed. If you're serious about making traction this year, let's talk. Visit moonshotos.com/SOS. That's MOONSHOTOS.com/SOS to learn more and set up a time to chat about the school operating system. Hi there, my friend. I'm Peter Barron. Welcome to today's episode of the Independent School Moonshot podcast. I'm really excited to have Mark Crotty on the show. Mark and I, it's funny, I live out in Seattle. Mark has lived in Seattle for a while now as well. He was the Executive Director of the Northwest Association of Independent Schools up until maybe like a month ago, right? About a month, right? So he had an amazing tenure there, did incredible work with schools, and is now a partner and consultant at Educator Collaborative and helping schools with head searches and other things, board work. And I would say, Mark, like once a quarter where we would get together and visit all the various coffee shops here in Seattle.
I think we've made the rounds of the entire Seattle Metroplex.
Yeah, I think you're right, and just talk shop and conversation about schools and the business side of it. And, one of the themes that we talk about a lot is just how the head's role has changed. I think since 2019, now in post-COVID world, it's just a different role. There are more considerations. There are more, in some ways, maybe more pressures, and certainly more kind of business requirements of a head. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to take that coffee shop conversation and bring it out and share it with you all here. But before we get into that, Mark Crotty, welcome to the podcast.
I am excited to be here, Peter. Conversations with you are always interesting, particularly because we usually start off somewhere and then we never quite know how it's going to branch out. So there may be some of that today, I would imagine.
I imagine. And before we even recorded, we ended up talking for like a half an hour. So it's always fun. Hey, but before we get into the conversation today, can you introduce yourself, talk a little bit about EC and the work that you're doing there?
Yeah. So I've been with independent schools, working with independent schools in different ways for 43 years now. And it kind of amazes me that I even got into this field, and particularly what I've been doing the last few years and what I'm starting to do now. When I was getting out of college, I didn't know what I was going to do. And I was talking to a career counselor, and she talked to me for a little while and said, you should think about working in an independent school. I was like, cool. What is that? And now 43 years later, here I am. Educators Collaborative I'm really excited to have joined them. When I knew I was leaving NWAIS, which was like a dream job in so many ways, but I knew I wanted to do one more thing in my life. And we're also really pulled back to being closer to family and friends. So as I was looking at different options, and I'd been talking to a couple of people at Educators Collaborative for a while, and we're a search firm technically, but we do so much more than search. And that's a big part of the appeal to me. We do search at all levels, but we're kind of a one-stop shop in many ways. We do a lot of governance work. We do a lot of executive coaching, and we do a lot of strategic planning. And a couple of things that really, I think I'm going to really appreciate about it. I'd say there's three things. One is the partners in the firm are all really experienced school leaders, but they're a very diverse group in terms of their experiences, their outlooks, their way of doing things. So it's a really eclectic group that makes it fun to work with them. Another thing I really value about them, I remember asking as I was pondering this choice, tell me something you really like about the firm. And somebody used the phrase that we're in a state of becoming all the time.
Hmm.
And I've seen that already, that the group is constantly rethinking how they do things, why they do things the way they do, and tweaking and adjusting. And then finally, the people there take the collaborative part of their name really, really seriously, both internally, how the partners work with each other, but also how we try to work with schools. It's not a cookie cutter approach by any means. So I'm really excited about it.
I think you're going to be great at it. I have no doubt in my mind. You're a collaborator at heart and have worked with, I mean, how many members are there? Is it 140 plus schools in NWAIS?
We're about 115 in NWAIS.
150.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of work that you've done. I know you've done a lot of board governance work too.
Yeah.
So but let's talk about the change in the head's role. So, I look at, I talk a lot about the kind of the pressures that our schools are facing, and it's everything from faculty and staff retention to tuition discounting to, it's just more expensive to build now, all these different things, right? Do you think that the headship has changed at the same pace as, say, the pressures is the changing pressures that are impacting independent schools right now?
Yes and no. And I want to step back from the question for a second and put it in a bit of a larger context, maybe, because I think the circumstances are going to really vary depending on the school.
Right.
It's going to vary by the size of the school, the resources the school has,
The market, right?
their market. I mean, all of these kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
But no matter what, and I remember it was early after I started at NWAIS, and I was talking with Bernie No, the former head at Lakeside, and Bernie saying, look, I don't care where you are ahead of school. If it's a small school, a big school, whatever, it is a really hard job. It's just hard in different ways. Now, to your question, I think you also, you mentioned earlier in the conversation about post-COVID. I think a lot of the things that are affecting headship now started well before COVID. And they just were sort of building. And I think COVID both revealed and accelerated some of them. The job has grown both more complicated and more complex. There's a lot more moving pieces, both internally and externally. And that just makes it a much more difficult thing, a lot more pressure packed. I think the other thing is that heads now have to look a lot more externally than they did 25, 30 years ago.
What does that look like for you?
Tell me what you mean by look like.
Well, if a head is looking more externally now than they say 25 years ago, what's driving that, and what do some of those external tasks look like?
Yeah, so a really good example of that, I remember my first decade and a half, maybe 2 decades in working in schools, and maybe I was just oblivious to it because I wasn't, up in the upper levels of administration. All the focus on marketing, for instance, I mean, that is a whole new thing in many ways for many schools that they didn't have to deal with before. I think the amount of fundraising that schools have to do now, whether it's because, they're doing so much tuition discounting to try to keep the enrollment up, or because of the pressures to have, constantly upgraded state-of-the-art facilities, or the keeping alumni better informed, all the pressures that have come with social media and the outward aspects of the school and trying to control the messaging and the brand and all of those things. Those aren't things that I think 25 or 30 years ago heads of school were having to think about that much.
And now a word from our sponsor. Leading a school today can mean juggling a dozen different systems across offices, finance, fundraising, marketing, enrollment, and academics, all pulling your attention in different directions. At Blackbaud, we believe it shouldn't be that way. That's why we built Blackbaud's Total School Solution. It's a fully connected solution designed for private and independent school leaders who want a clear view of their entire operation. From tuition to transcript to donation, you get one ecosystem, one login, and one source of truth. This isn't about more software. It's about smarter strategy. When your systems work together, you spend less time chasing down data and more time leading. Want to see what Blackbaud's total school solution could do for your school? Visit blackbaud.com. That's BLACKBAUD.com to learn more. Yeah. Do you think the assumptions about what makes a good head 20 years, I mean, like there's been a set of assumptions, right? That I think, they're going to shift per school, but like, do you think that if you generalize those assumptions, are they kind of up to date with where we need to be now as we're looking at the role, as we're considering new heads of school?
You go back to the origins of the term, right? Head of school and what it was before. All right. And, I hate to be sexist about it, but, it used to be headmaster or headmistress.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like a dictatorial kind of term. It was, if you were the headmaster or the headmistress, you were the lead academic in the school. You were the head teacher. You were the one who set the academic tone, the academic program, all of those sorts of things. I think people still want to see the head of school that way, but I don't know that many heads of school now have the time or space to do that, even though I think a lot of people want them to be and would like them to be, and maybe even some of those heads would like to be.
I 100% agree. I mean, Mark, we've talked about this endlessly. I've talked about it here on the pod. I mean, I've just interviewed so many heads of school over the last couple of years, and virtually all of them say exactly what you just talked about, where like they really are not the academic visionary. They're running a very complicated institution that has them thinking deeply about financial based questions, all sorts of things that maybe weren't as prevalent, 15, 20 years ago. I don't know. I mean, I know we've talked about this in the past, but like, how do you react to that?
Well, it's just a reality of the situation, right?
Yeah.
When you're a teacher in a school, you don't like to think about the business aspect of things. I mean, some people got into education because they couldn't imagine going into business, right?
Absolutely.
And then as you move up the ranks in an independent school, you realize very quickly, this is a business, and it is a very complicated business. So you've mentioned these conversations that you've had with heads, and I would imagine another theme that comes up in there as they're talking about, it being increasingly complex and this, what they have to focus on and so forth. Another theme there is loneliness.
Absolutely. 100%.
Because very few people get it. Very few people understand it unless they've, been in that seat and done that work. And a lot of people, they don't know how the head of school spends their time, and they haven't thought about all the other aspects involved in this.
Yeah, it's not like they're, like when you're a director of director of enrollment, for instance, you can slide over and have a very kind of frank conversation with the director of advancement, right? You're kind of on the same level, dealing with similar issues. But when you're the head of school, like, who do you talk to? Which is where I think coaching has become so important to independent school heads over the last few, like the number of coaches that are supporting this industry has really grown, and for good reason, because it is a very lonely job.
Well, and there's an irony in that loneliness too, in that, and this explains the complexity of the job. And as I said, ironically, that it leads to loneliness. The head of school is really the only person in a school who is the touch point for every other individual connected to the school. And that's kind of heavy duty stuff.
That's heavy, right? It can weigh you down for sure.
Yeah, yeah. And so one of the ways that, there's been to try to combat that is you mentioned the rise in coaching. Okay. And I am 100% behind that. When I was ahead of school, my coach was absolutely invaluable to me. And it was great because we had no agenda. It was, what do you need to talk about? It was a very pastoral role in many ways.
They're there to support you.
Yeah, yeah. I think that some of the other ways that we have tried to sort of address the problem, while they've probably helped in some ways, well, I know they've helped in some ways because they were necessary to keep it going, but again, they sort of added to the complexity in that, particularly if you're a larger school, for instance, leadership teams and the staff under the people on that leadership team have grown.
Yeah.
So you've added more pieces there that the head of school has to both manage and lead. And that adds complexity to it.
Yeah. I've talked to heads who have like direct reports numbering 12, 13, 14 people.
Yeah. How do you handle that?
I can't even fathom.
Yeah. And then you get in situations where they say, well, the job has become so big, so let's create co-heads. And maybe I'm old school, but I have a hard time seeing how you don't have somebody who's kind of the head or somebody in charge, the decision maker. And that just seems really hard to me.
Well, I think it speaks to the complexity of the role, right? And I think you've talked about it. It's not just complex, but it's more complicated now as well. So when I think about it, like I step back and I, talk to heads and, they often say how, they become a head and they realize that there are a lot of business considerations and maybe they weren't necessarily prepped for that as deeply as they could have been. I'm curious. Let's kind of focus right now on the aspiring leader, somebody who wants to become a head. Because I imagine, they're probably folks listening to this who like, okay, that's in my career trajectory. I want to be a head. I want to lead a community. What kind of skills should they be thinking about, or maybe mindsets that they think are really important for them as they're preparing to become that future leader, that future head of school?
Yeah. So I'll start off really big picture on that and then kind of burrow down. If someone is considering the path towards headship, I think the first question that they've got to really spend time grappling with is, why do they want to do it? What's the motivation? And I don't mean that because the job is so complicated or complex and do you really want to take that on. It's, are you doing this because you feel called, because you see it as an act of service, or is it because you need the title? Because you're going to draw some sort of personal fulfillment from that. Now, I don't mean that the job shouldn't be fulfilling and that you shouldn't, draw some pride and joy and all of that from doing the job. But I'm saying if just being in the role is kind of the ultimate be all and end all, then you have to kind of question that. You better have real self-awareness of yourself as a leader, your motivation, your style, all of those kinds of things. What are you willing to give up to do the job? Because it becomes so all-consuming in certain ways. So you have to really be aware of what you're getting yourself into.
Can I ask a question about that? What's the best way for them to figure that out? Because that's a difficult thing to assess.
It is a really difficult, and I don't know that there is a good way to figure that out. I think you just have to be aware that it's going to cost you in that regard. Now, at the same time, I don't think it has to where it detracts from every other aspect of your life. I think there are ways to balance it. You have to learn to be a good delegator. You have to exercise as much distributed leadership as you possibly can. But I think one of the other things that somebody has to think about going into this is, if you're a control freak, this job is going to overwhelm you because of the number of pieces. So you've got to be comfortable with knowing that you can't control as much as you might like to control. And so there's a degree of trust in there. And if you can figure out the right way to manage that, or you're already in a good headspace when it comes to that, then I think you can keep the job from overwhelming you. I remember when I became a head of school, before I accepted the job, I talked with the board leadership at the school where I was going. I said, look, I want you to understand that I'm going to be a father and a husband first before I'm a head of school. They completely agreed with that. And I was fortunate that I was in a community that really honored that.
Yeah. Yeah.
They understood that. So I think you've got to be clear about that up front.
What about team building? I mean, I think that speaks to, distributed leadership and, not really kind of being a control freak, micromanager. Just feels like, just from personal, look, I was not a head of school, but I ran a big team. And it's like, if you don't have the right team in place, it just makes things really hard.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a constant piece of work. You're not going to build a team because you have your beginning of the year retreat.
Right.
Or something like that.
Right.
I'm actually getting ready to do a workshop at a school for their leadership team with just that idea in mind. And it's, we're going to do some of the typical, kind of get to know each other really well as a person, because that makes you a better team sort of thing. But when I do workshops like that, part of what I also do is, here are some tools that you can use in your meetings going forward to kind of make sure you keep these principles at the forefront. I think it's also, you constantly have to be sort of seeing your team in a state of transformation or growth. And I don't necessarily mean new people coming in, but how are you evolving as a team? What kind of team are you now? What kind of team do you need to become to better serve your community? So even if you're not changing people, there's sort of a reforming, restorming, renorming that's a regular cycle going on.
Yeah, absolutely. If you think, just take the example of a strategic plan, Mark, and, you create a vision as part of that planning process. But that vision could be 5 or 10 years out. It's not going to happen today. But the way your team is kind of focused in any given year is going to shift based on how you're marching towards that vision. And that's just part of being a leader, is understanding that things are going to change over time as even if you have the most clear vision, like, you're going to have to think differently with each passing year about how are you going to get there.
Yeah. And in some ways, elements of that vision may change as well.
Right. Market's going to tell you a lot, right?
Yeah. And vision is an interesting word, because it's something else that I think is really important for a head of school to be able to do. That is something that I don't think we thought about as much 15 or 20 years ago. And I don't think of it. Yes, vision is definitely part of it. But what I tend to focus more on is the head of school, or really any good leader, as somebody who helps others see possibilities, whether it's possibilities for the school or it's possibilities for somebody on your team.
Yeah.
And what they can become. As a teacher, ideally what you're doing is seeing possibilities in each student.
Yep.
And I think when you're the head of school, it's the same thing, just on a different scale.
Yeah. I'm curious, do you think that as the demands are changing, like, we're doing enough to prep future heads for this ever evolving head of school job?
Yes and no. I think a lot of it depends on what situation somebody is in, whether they're going to get that or not. You see things like the Aspiring Heads program by NAIS, other leadership programs, and I think they're all great, and I think they're all necessary, and I think they're all important, but they don't do enough because they're done in such isolation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times they're very theoretical, even though you have to do some kind of project or something like that. So it's more, what is the person getting to do in their role? And is that going to prepare them? Are they getting to do different kinds of situations, different sort of problem solving? One of the things that was most helpful to me was when I had to chair a school's self-study process, because I had to manage so many different pieces. And while I was doing that, I also learned so much about the different aspects of the school.
Yeah.
So, you know, as a head, I always saw as part of my responsibility and even a desire in some ways that if I had somebody who wanted to move up, whether it was to an administrative role or to eventually become a head of school, to put them in as many situations as possible to where they could gain those kinds of things. Now, having said that, even if somebody's had multiple experiences and great experiences, until you're sitting in that chair, you're not fully ready.
Right. Sure.
There's just too much. It's too new. Suddenly you are the person. The other thing that I would say where we're falling short, and I don't have a solution to this, is how do you work with a board? So many people, even if they sat in board meetings and maybe even done presentations, they don't know how to work with a board.
Mm.
And I think that is similar to headship becoming, when this isn't, we haven't talked about it all in this conversation yet. Part of what is making headship so much harder and so much more complex is because working with boards has become so much more difficult.
Why is that?
They are much, well, I think it's tied to a lot of the pressures that we've been talking about. I mean, boards are ultimately responsible for the long-term sustainability of the school, right? And the school thriving. So they are feeling all the same pressures that the heads are feeling, plus, that they don't necessarily understand the school from a cultural point, a mission point, those kinds of things. They tend to be very results driven, very, very metrics driven, want really quick results. Sometimes they see things in a very input, output kind of way. And all of that really makes it difficult. I think there also a lot of times is, I guess I would describe it as tension in who's kind of leading whom here. A lot of times there's this talk of the separation between the strategic and the operational. Boards are supposed to be the strategic ones, leave operations to the head. Well, it's a false dichotomy. Those things should be very much informing each other. The operational decisions should be aligned with the larger strategy of the school. The board should not be making strategic vision plans, all of these kinds of things without significant input from the head of school as the leader of the school. And I always describe it as, okay, yes, head of school, technically in a contractual sense, yes, you work for the board. But if this is working really, really well, the board should want to work for the head, at least in a metaphorical, if not a contractual sense.
I'm curious, Mark, how can search committees and rethink how they evaluate and select heads? Because I think you talked about earlier, like the head teacher and the academic, but yet, now in this role is just so complicated and oftentimes requires focus in areas that aren't necessarily related to what's happening in the classroom. But yet we tend to kind of move in that direction.
Yeah.
Often. I'm curious.
Yeah. And similarly, I guess there still is a fairly traditional ladder, I guess, to become a head of school. You're in this position, then this position, then this position, and so forth and so on. And in some ways that makes sense because that's the most likely way that you're going to gain the experience and skills and all of that. But I think we miss out on a lot of really talented people because of that. So here's what I would encourage boards to be thinking about. Well, first, I'd say they need to forget something that is often the case. A lot of times they're putting together who they want, and they create this sort of Frankenstein's monster of let's get a person who doesn't have any of the stuff that we didn't like about the previous head, but also has all the stuff that we did like about the previous head. And then these other things that we just think would be really great. And they kind of put it all together in their ideal candidate. Well, there is no ideal candidate. So this is what I would say. Don't think of this just as a hiring decision. Board, if you are supposed to be strategic, think about this as the most important strategic decision you are ever going to make on behalf of this school. And so you need to be thinking not about the right now, not just what are the immediate problems to be solved, but what is the best hire we can make for the long term? And as you're looking at candidates, be really open. Think about the person over the resume. Think about not who is this person right now and how are they going to hit the ground running, though that matters, but what can this person become? How can this person and the school grow together?
Yeah.
And what can they grow into over time? Similarly, don't over-design the job and the expectations. It all has to sort of evolve. And then one other thing that I would really encourage boards to think about when they're going through this, they spend so much time looking at the candidates and what does this candidate have that's going to let them succeed? Okay. I mean, that's their job, right? Find the best candidate that we can for the job. But I think for this to really become the best possible match over the long term and for it to succeed over the long term, boards also have to spend some time looking at themselves and saying, how are we positioned to help this person succeed? Have we put ourselves in the right place? Have we been taking care of the things that need to be taken care of so we are ready to help this person transition into this role? And I don't care if that's a new head or an experienced head.
Yeah.
The success is not entirely on the head. It's on the board with the head.
So I guess, as we begin to wrap up here, Mark, and we talked a little bit about it before, but I do always like to end the pod with something kind of actionable for a person who's listening. So let's kind of frame this for the aspiring leader, somebody who wants to be a future head of school. As they're considering headship, are there any kind of essential questions they need to ask themselves to determine if it's the right fit for them in this moment? I know we talked a little bit about it, but maybe we could kind of cap it with that question.
Yeah, I think it's being really clear on why you want to do this. But beyond in a professional sense, what's the personal drive there? What are the personal values there? What is it that's calling you to do this? That has to be at the essence of anything. I mean, it's sort of like, I think sometimes the reason strategy fails is because the people doing the strategy, there's nothing at the core of it. So it becomes a bunch of wishes and tasks and additions. So I think a lot of really hard reflection and what is it that is at my core that would pull me towards this work and then sustain me through this work, that I can kind of keep going back to what becomes my energy source as I do this job.
I love that. Yeah. What's at your core? That's a great way of thinking about it. Mark Crotty, partner and consultant at Educators Collaborative. Thank you. And good friend. I appreciate you coming on the pod to talk about this changing role and with just giving your perspective from all your experience. Thank you.
Always fun. Thank you so much for having me. And we did this without coffee in our hands.
Well, it's right here.
I
I always have it close by. Mark, thanks again.
All right, my friend. Be well.